Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. Most people today understand that mental health is one of the great crises facing the United States and facing the world. It comes for so many different reasons, and it's exaggerated increasingly in our day for many different social, economic, and political reasons. This is all part of why we need the very best mental health services, and why I'm so delighted today to welcome Dr. Mark Eastburg as our guest on Conversing. Mark is the president and chief executive officer of Pine Rest Christian Mental Health Services in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In addition to that location, they have outpatient clinics in 20 different parts of the state of Michigan, and they have 250 residential care beds, among many other programs, including a fairly recently established adolescent emergency care mental health program as well. Pine Rest is one of the largest and most well-respected Christian mental health services in the United States. Their work is creative, it's responsive, it's Christian, it's dedicated to the best kind of research and trying to provide the best kind of treatments. When you're needing the right professional, you need the right professional. And I know that this is what Pine Rest is committed to. Fuller Seminary Psych School and Pine Rest have had a long-established relationship. And in addition to all the other things I've said about Mark, Mark is also an alum of Fuller Theological Seminary's clinical psych program. Welcome, Mark. We're so glad you're here today on Conversing.
Thank you, Mark. It's good to be here in a conversation with you.
You know, I've had great respect for you in the last number of years as we've gotten to know one another, and through the work of Pine Rest, which is really quite remarkable in its reach and in influence. And your leadership in helping to bring it to the state that it's in right now is a very significant piece of this. But I'd like to kind of back away from Pine Rest in particular, for starters, and just have you, as a mental health professional who leads this major Christian enterprise, give us a picture of what you think the mental health landscape is that we're living in. Obviously, that's impossible to adequately summarize briefly, but give us some of the things that you see and how you have seen those change, let's say, in the last decade.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think an important way to tell the story is to start with COVID. So before COVID hit in 2020, what we were seeing is a ramp up of mental health needs, especially for kids. And we were running really hard to keep up with that need, that demand. The wait time for psychiatrists, at least in our area, could be 4 to 6 months and even longer for kids. And so obviously, if you have a child that is in a psychiatric crisis, you can't wait 5 to 6 months. And so we were working really hard to try to solve that problem. Our board-directed vision was around psychiatric access, behavioral health access. But it felt like even though we were advancing, the problem was growing faster than we were able to accommodate. And the way that showed up was wait times for psychiatrists. It was also showing up in terms of, so often the headlines were taken up by people, like kids who struggle with mental illness that weren't getting services, that sometimes resulted in violence. There were a lot of stories, especially in Michigan, about adults and children boarding in emergency rooms. And so we were very focused on doing something around access, especially for kids. And we started a conversation with a local children's hospital, had some ideas, especially kids with autism who weren't being well served. And then COVID hit. And we hunkered down. We said, okay, we just have to get through this. Let's help each other. We did. Our team did some research during this time. What is the mental impact of pandemics, or what's the impact of pandemics on mental health, and saw globally, when there's a pandemic, there's this aftermath of mental health challenges. So we began to anticipate that, wondering what will that look like here in the US?
Yes.
And then as the COVID viral load dropped, we saw this unfortunately expected surge of mental health needs really across the board, adults, but especially kids, especially adolescents. And the losses with COVID that have to do with just the disruption of their lives, the losses that they experience, both loss of family and friends, in some cases, loss of time with peers for those 2 years where there was a pretty strong lockdown here in Michigan. And then an intense focus then on kids online, whether it be in classes or their friendships were online, lots of time in front of screens. We just saw this surge of mental health challenges. And I think that's been the story around the country, because I've surveyed other places in the country. Therapists are full. There are wait times. There's not enough services in many cases. And the teachers who are my friends that I know are saying, yeah, the kids that we see, it seems like they've lost a couple of years socially, and in terms of developing the resiliency of being out in the community. So that caused us to respond, to work on a pediatric center of behavioral health, which we can talk about at some point. But so into that high demand, what we've also seen is kind of a flow of investment capital. People see an opportunity, there's a lot of need. And so we're seeing the emergence of online services, online therapy services, telepsychiatry, some digital health focused on mental health, and actually a pretty significant growth in terms of therapy training programs. So while the need is up, we also see this new sort of market change in terms of people seeing an opportunity to serve and make money in this space.
And especially online.
You're right.
Right. So drilling in a little bit on what you were seeing with children, what would be some of the categories of diagnoses that began to surge within that broader mental health concern? I'm sure there's all sorts of ways that this manifested itself, but were there certain nodes of diagnoses that particularly surged?
Yeah, a lot of anxiety, Mark. When a kid hasn't been to school for a couple of years, the idea of going back to school can seem really overwhelming. And again, being sort of out of the back and forth of in-person. Mm-hmm. I was at a clinic recently, and one of the phenomena that is showing up is kids, adolescents even, they don't want to talk on the phone. If they need to cancel an appointment, if they can't do it online, they'll get another adult to make the call, because that call is so intimidating even to leave a message. So there's this sort of sense of diminished resiliency perhaps among some kids, because they have come behind. And what we've seen too is an increase on our inpatient side. So these are kids who are coming into the hospital because they're a danger to themselves or others, just a higher level of acuity or aggression toward others, self-harm. That's always been there. That's been the criteria for hospitalization, but more intense levels of that. I was meeting with a child psychiatrist that works for us just this morning. He said, the post-COVID world, everything seems to have become more intense, and fueled by social media in many cases, fueled by the legalization of marijuana in our area. Our therapists are saying that's really pouring kerosene on some of the mental health challenges as well.
Now, Pine Rest, because it is this multi-service providing agency, also interacts, of course, with adults. And so what did you find as the kind of child and adolescent mental health crisis was emerging? Were you seeing the same kind of thing in a parallel way among adults, or how would you describe the correlation?
Yeah, we were. There was an uptick both in people seeking services, substance use disorders, increased use of alcohol, other kinds of drugs. really everything that was there before just sort of turned up a notch. That seems to be leveling off right now. And we're not sure what that's about, if it's people who have, say, lost insurance and just don't have the resources, because the Medicaid rolls are down in Michigan anyway. But we're seeing really a parallel situation with adults, but perhaps just a little bit less intensity. What's interesting is we made a big pivot into teletherapy during the COVID, because you couldn't sit in a small office with your therapist and be socially distanced. And somewhat counterintuitively, it's the adolescents that want to come back in person. They don't want to be online. They don't want to do the teletherapy thing, unless it's big inconvenience, but they want to be there in person, in the flesh. And that was a little bit unexpected.
Yes, I can see that it would be. Well, I do know that just in what I've been reading about, for example, alcohol sales falling off after COVID in a significant degree, more than they would have anticipated, especially hard liquor as a way of just deciding to say no to a pattern that in some cases emerged even for the first time during the COVID days. So I think that's in parallel to what you're just describing.
Yeah, we saw the surge of use during COVID, especially. I heard one story locally in Grand Rapids. There's a community, it's a neighborhood in Grand Rapids, a lot of young adults, a lot of them working in bars or taverns. And the reports I heard is there was nothing to do. There was no job. And so alcohol was kind of the go-to entertainment for them. And out of that came a lot of alcohol use, heavy alcohol use. And so, yeah, I think maybe that has subsided a little bit now as people have gotten back into the rhythm of their lives, but it was definitely a part of the COVID response.
Right. You know, I think all of us who care about children have been following some of the reports that have been coming out about the impact of COVID. And one of the things that I'm curious if you'd comment about is that it seems as though, and we would see this as obvious, it's hardly an insight, except that it does seem like it's underscored because of COVID, namely that we are really shaped and developed by practices. And when those practices, in this case, let's call it just school as an example.
Yeah.
When those practices are interrupted, something developmentally really happens. I mean, there's a genuine break in what is a routine. And kids have always liked and disliked school, of course.
Right.
But the thought that somehow now this wrench, this very serious wrench, is thrown into the practice of what going to school means. And for so many, it was really a distasteful experience. And the practice therefore wasn't just eliminated like falling out of running regularly, for example, but it was really negative as well as a break in the routine.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you want to comment on that.
Yeah. So, we might think back, what did we learn in fifth grade? Well, I, learned about the Native Americans, the California missions where I grew up. I learned a certain mathematics, but what we forget is that we're learning social skills that are not on the curriculum. It's those practices of going out to recess and interacting with friends and interacting with people with whom you have conflict. Those are the routines and practices that get mediated within a school setting or a church setting or any other kinds of institutions,
right.
Even family gatherings. And so when you interrupt those practices, we forget, maybe especially with kids or adolescents as well, how you stop learning things, even though it's not, described as something that in a formal way you're learning.
I wonder if you could help me with this. When adults and children express themselves through unexpected and even violent anger, one of the things that is hard often to keep in mind is that it's really a reflection of something that is actually really a great sense of insecurity and fear and dislocation and vulnerability that's really underneath that. Not to diminish it by saying that like, oh, there, just get over it. I'm meaning it more in the sense of here's this bravado that's coming at you, whether it was a parent, a teacher, a therapist,
right,
a friend, a neighbor, whatever it might be. but really somehow remembering that beneath all that, there's really not always in a stereotypical way, but commonly there is a great fear and anxiety underneath it that's causing this reaction.
Yeah.
So when a therapist, for example, is trying to help a child face underlying reality when they're presenting behavior that's sort of the opposite of that, or peers give that impression, how does that get approached in a therapeutic context?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll describe that by using a more extreme example. So we have a program here at Pine Rest. It's for adolescents who have been in the foster care system, and more specifically for adolescents who have not been successful in this foster care system and who have, in some cases, spent years in state psychiatric hospitals. And often part of those stories are abuse and neglect. And it's everything horrible that you can imagine: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment by parents at 8 years old. And if that's been your experience of the world, accompanied by never having a birthday party, never ever receiving a Christmas present, never being in a home that you knew you were going to be at for more than a month, you develop a view of the world as a really dangerous place, full of unexpected, or
Absolutely.
anything can happen at any time. And so in those situations, those kids are often hyper alert to threats and dangers. And so they haven't been able to learn sort of negotiation skills. So to survive, you got to lash out. You have to protect yourself, and obviously it comes across as threatening, but as you really insightfully pointed out, the threats they're experiencing are being triggered. And so one of the best practices in those situations, and this gets to your question, is really use a trauma-informed approach, and using the insight that you gave. Like there's fear here, there's anxiety here, there's threat here. And so recognizing that as a care provider would approach that child, recognizing that my actions, my words could set this person off, and recognize there's trauma behind that, and using a set of tools then to understand the potential trauma reaction, different kinds of language around that to help the child recognize there isn't a danger here, and there's another way to manage this. Mm-hmm. And so, again, that's a more extreme version, but really it's approaching with empathy. Mm-hmm. It's really underneath it all. And listen and carefully putting yourself in another person's worldview and location to see what their world might be like underneath the symptoms and bravado that's there.
It's really, just from my point of view, such sacred ground to get to go there with anyone, whatever their age. And it's also really, really complicated, because when you know your own social circumstance may be so radically different than theirs, mm-hmm. it can easily be triggering just for the person you're talking to know that you don't really share their social experience.
No.
And that you haven't lived life in their terms. And to me, it gets right at that raw nerve of human vulnerability, mutual mm-hmm. vulnerability. The therapist, to express such empathy, has to themselves be prepared to manifest their own vulnerability to the person who has their own underlying vulnerabilities for the reasons you've just starkly expressed.
Right.
What observation do you have about that?
So I had a wise supervisor once early in my career who said, Mark, if you just react to people's symptoms, you're going to get more symptoms. But if you can look past the symptoms and see what he liked to call the beautiful human being underneath everybody, anyone that you interact with, you'll see more of that. But that's incredibly hard work to do that.
Is.
And sometimes you you bear it's secondary trauma. You bear the trauma that they experience in a way. But I'm really convinced that that bit of insight, that bit of deep empathy, being able to look for what I would call the image of God in each person is really the path toward healing. But it's really hard work. It's sacrificial work, sacrificial empathy, because it's so easy for us to just react to the behavior that's there, the comments that are there, the insults that are there, even the physical assaults that are there. We're all human, we react.
Mm-hmm.
And so to persistently look past that and to see the person it's a great challenge, but I think doing that results in what I like to call healing moments, as people feel heard and understood and listened to. And I think those healing moments, and I tell our team all the time, we're in the healing moments business. That's what we do. Everything we do is to support those healing moments. And I think those healing moments are the building blocks of the kingdom of God, just like atoms are the building blocks of the material world. It builds up healing and hope and community.
So is that one of the key things that defines, quote, an approach to the use of psychology in responding to human need as a Christian vocation, as a Christian way of doing therapy? Is it what you've just described? And if it is, make those connections. And then if it's that and more, what are the other elements?
Yeah. So my thinking has really grown over the last, I've been out, I was a Fuller graduate. I am a Fuller graduate, and I've been here at Pine Rest since my internship at Fuller. And I would say the ability to look at people made in God's image is one of the key kind of foundation stones of what it means to be a Christian organization. Now, there are other fine secular organizations that have a high regard for human dignity, human purpose. So I wouldn't claim that that's an exclusive Christian value. But I do have a friend that did some time working in another institution, psychiatric institution, and he came back after 3 months kind of in an interim role, and he said, he had been at Pine Rest for a long time. He said, I got to take a look at an organization that cares for people that doesn't embrace human dignity. And it was a shock. And it's like fishing. Around here, we think in terms of, human dignity and people of high value, but it is possible to actually even run a hospital without that. And it's not the kind of care you and I would want. So that would be one element of, I think it's a building block of what Christian care is like. And especially in the last 5 years or so, I've been impacted by, I think, a deeper insight and a deeper understanding. I'm almost embarrassed that it took me this long to see it, of how Jesus' care for the outsider, for the downtrodden, the excluded, is so core to his mission and ministry. Our mission statement is to express the healing ministry of Jesus Christ. And that's what that looks like. Some people suffering from mental illness can be on the outside, excluded, certainly downtrodden. And I think a core principle of, if we're going to represent ourselves as expressing the healing ministry of Jesus, is to always be looking for who is on the outside that we need to bring in? Who are we missing here? What ways are we subtly not treating our patients, whether it's outpatient or inpatient, as human beings made in the image of God and somebody's favorite brother or sister, because they are somebody's favorite brother or sister? It's a constant challenge to keep looking at people through the eyes of that dignity. So I think that's another really key component of what it means to be doing mental health from a Christian context, but also recognizing that we're more than just physical beings. People who come to us are more than just collections of symptoms to be treated, but they're wanting to flourish. They're wanting to strive for what is their meaning and purpose in life. And that isn't always part of the medical model. But I think it's a richer view of human persons that we need to embrace as people attempting to follow Jesus in the way we do our work.
Right. I'm curious if the colleague who left for a few minutes and came back and made the observation he did about human dignity, did he say what that institution he was connected to did put as its foundation or centerpiece, or the central assumption about human life or its meaning?
It was people as things to be treated and behavior to be managed.
Uh-huh. Right.
And a job to get done.
Right.
And get through your shift. And in some cases, just keep the lid on.
Right. Just the management in a way of the crisis, but not actually seeing the person.
Right. And maybe this is a stretch, but maybe how you manage a machine. You want to keep it running smoothly. You repair pieces that are broken, but there isn't obviously a personal connection to a machine, or this sense of wishing the machine to flourish. And,
right.
It's just keeping it going, keeping it running.
Wow. What a stark contrast. I know that you mentioned earlier this adolescent clinic that your program and clinic that you have going. I'd love to hear more about that, because I think everyone who's, again, watching and reading about what's going on with teenagers these days is especially concerned about mental health issues. And because I know Pine Rest has made such an important response, tell us more about that and what you're discovering.
Yeah. So as we came out of COVID, we re-engaged the Children's Hospital partner, and the need came roaring back. And we sort of looked at each other and said, this is the moment to do something really big and really generational. There was a lot of money, frankly, out there, American Rescue Plan dollars, that became available for mental health because everyone recognized it was such a need, across the political spectrum. And so it was more like, if you could come up with a solid plan, that those resources were available. So that's what we did. And we said, let's make a once in a generation investment in pediatric behavioral health services, inpatient, day hospitalization, psychiatric urgent care for kids. Let's make it a statewide program that can serve the whole state of Michigan and beyond. Some specialty clinics that for services that really aren't available now. Because this American Rescue Plan dollars, it's one-time money. And if our grandchildren are going to be paying down the national debt that funded this, they ought to be able to benefit from it. And the Republicans especially like that. But it was across the aisle, we got support. And so we had a good start with some state dollars, and then philanthropists have pretty much taken us to the finish line with the $100 million project that we have.
It's amazing. Now, what will emerge? Give us examples of.
Yeah, so a psychiatric urgent care center. So instead of, again, that 3 months, 4 month, 5 month wait, just walk in and we'll sort it out. We'll figure out what you need. Instead of needing to go to the emergency room and sometimes getting boarded for days, just come in and we'll probably have what you need. There'll be a specialty unit for kids with autistic spectrum disorders who typically don't do well in a children's hospital and don't do well in even our usual traditional psychiatric unit where there's group therapies and it's highly verbal. There'll be a special unit for those kids that will help them to get to the next level of care. Depression clinic, anxiety clinic, where we can really focus and specialize on those. We have started eating disorders day program. Our goal is to start a lot of programs early. And so when we move into the new building, it'll be full the first day and we won't need to ramp up.
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. How has this been received across the state of Michigan? I know your particular work is focused in this way, but how has it been received more broadly?
Really positive. It's probably one of the easiest things to go to the community and ask for. Can you support us? We have a plan, because everyone has a story, right? I have stories in my own family, and state legislators were saying, well, I wish this was around when my son or daughter needed this, or I have a nephew that could. I wish this was here now. It's so universal in what mental health, how it touches all of our lives. And so it was, we just had to present it, and people got the vision really quickly. So that was really encouraging. It felt like the community was really coming together around this project.
Right. Well, congratulations on being a key leader in that, but also thank God for all the resources, private and public, that were available to make all this really happen. I'm so aware in many areas of social need that the question of ongoing funding is one of the big dilemmas, and things get started, wonderful initiatives are taken, and then it's very hard to sustain.
Right.
So how will that actually work out in this case? Who will sustain this financially? Will it be philanthropists, or will it be insurance companies? I'm sure it's a matrix of many things.
You're right. So this actually gets back into our heritage at Pine Rest. So we were started by the Dutch Reformed immigrant community. And if you know anything about that community, at least in West Michigan, they're fiscally conservative. And the standard for us as nonprofit leaders at Pine Rest has been, you got to break even on operations. You can't fundraise to keep the lights on. And so some Christian organizations, they're not able to do that with the income stream. They have to fundraise, but that's been our approach. And so when the pediatric center opens, it will need to sustain itself financially through insurance payments, commercial insurance. We do fundraise to offer public assistance to people who maybe can't make up a copay, but that's a separate branch. And then also Medicaid is an important funder of behavioral health services for adults and kids. And so obviously we're looking really closely at what's going on in Washington with, at this moment, some talked about cuts in funding. So that's an important conversation that we're participating in DC. But from our pro forma perspective, it breaks even.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. So one of the things that's happening in mental health is just this broad inequities, partly because social circumstances and other factors set up some of the terms of our mental health. And therefore, where injustice exists, often there is greater mental health crises. It's not always correlated in that way, but when it is correlated that way, then it makes it even harder. So there's the mental health crisis itself, but then there might be the injustice of access to power or resources to be able to help. It's also the case that often underlying injustices contribute to mental health crises. Mm-hmm. So just talk to us about how that plays into your perception of what's going on.
Yeah. So I really see mental health work, mental health ministry as really justice work in many, many cases for some of the reasons you mentioned. And my simple definition of justice would be when a person's right to certain way of being treated is violating the image of God in them. And in picking up on that theme, the biblical theme of justice is interwoven with caring for those who are seen as defective or inferior or excluded, alien, different, outsiders. As you mentioned, injustices can be so often the cause of mental illness. I mentioned earlier those kids who have been abused and neglected, and going through a program where they're really literally building from scratch their ability to relate socially to other kids, to other adults, to begin to catch up in school, to thinking of one young man we're caring for, he's learning to be a welder. And that would have been unthinkable for him a few years ago. That's really, in a lot of ways, restorative justice.
Right.
There was one person I was aware of who was a teller at a bank and who was the victim of the bank robbery. And the person that came in with the gun held the gun to her head for 5 minutes. And this resulted in a panic attack, not being able to get out of her house or, go shopping. And so helping her get back into the community was, the therapist that worked with her was doing justice work.
Right.
And people struggling with mental illness are often the victims of injustices. So we have had a team that works with people who are experiencing homelessness, and there can be sort of a social pecking order among people who are unhoused. And our team has told me consistently that people with mental illness are almost at the bottom of that. They're the ones who are victimized. They're having their bridge card stolen. They're the ones who are robbed in other ways, who are victims of violence or sexual attacks. So if we can help somebody with their mental illness so that they can get to a safe housing environment, we're really preventing further injustices to them. So, especially there's a, younger cohort that is passionate about justice. And maybe 20 years ago, I would say, well, we're doing the work of compassion. That's true. But in many ways, when they are involved in caring for individuals who have been victims of injustice, they're doing justice work. It's very much part of social justice, or people can be a therapist and involved in doing social justice.
I've often thought that justice is about rightly ordered power. And one of the things that mental health crises or issues make clear is how much power is floating as a free particle in their minds, where they can be dive bombed by abuses of power of so many different kinds, and then fantastical uses of power that can unfold, as well as the literal abuses of power that can come against people in different ways, or that they fear can come against them. I just think it is justice work, and I'm glad that you have taken up this claim, because I think it's part of the resetting of the table of a person's life to be able to honor that in the mix of all the other factors that are present.
And in the larger picture, if we can bring about justice, the right ordering of power, then we're approaching shalom, right? For a community, we're contributing to the health and welfare of the community in which we've been placed. It's that story of exile, that we're doing what we need to do to help our neighbors and bring about our vision of what a just society can be, where people are treated with dignity and respect.
Right. You and I have spoken in other times about the wonder, the awesome wonder that it is to come close to a person through these specialized settings. In my case, it wasn't as a mental health professional, it was really as a pastor. But in other ways beyond of a specific job-related way, it happens, or it can happen, in the context of simply friendship and presence and being near people who have particular kinds of needs. And I think, as a pastor, I've looked at this often wondering, what is it that stokes a readiness for empathy, a courage for empathy, a willingness to lean toward the pain rather than to immediately hope to deflect and get someone professional in on the job. Now, there's plenty of times when that's precisely the right response. But there's also plenty of times when that maybe isn't the first step to be taken. It may just be connection, but often to risk connection takes people further outside their comfort zone than they are necessarily prepared to do. So I'm just curious, when you think about that, developing that instinct, which obviously in the context of a professional institution like Pine Rest, you have people who are trained and educated to do the work that you're doing. But I just know because of who you are that you're a person that also thinks about how culture around people sets the stage for the proximity to simply an acknowledgement of care, of empathy, of love, of attention, of dignity, as you say. Do you have any reflections that you'd like to just share about that?
Yeah. So one of the things this underscores something you just said. I don't think we can train enough therapists to solve all the mental health challenges that are out there right now. I think we have to go further upstream and to get better at exactly what you're talking about, that perhaps some of why we're here in a crisis is that people do feel isolated. They aren't part of a group. They're looking for that. Maybe they haven't found it at school, or they haven't found it in a church setting or in a neighborhood setting, or even in their family setting. And those institutions really need to thrive as institutions so they can be safe places. They can be places where people feel like they belong, are cared for. And, it seems simplistic to say if a person feels cared for, they're probably much more likely to show empathy and compassion. But that involves those healthy institutions, I think. I mean, my first, deeper friendships came in the context of a church youth group, and where I felt like I belonged, and I had people that cared about me. I had adults in the church that cared about me. And that was such a good base to stand on. But if I didn't feel a part of things, that wouldn't have happened. So the health of our institutions has a direct influence on the mental health of our community. And I think we'll do better as a society when those cultures are thriving. My hope for the church is that becomes again for so many kids and adults a place where they can feel safe. They do sense that they belong, that here's a place worth committing to as well, and a place where I can not just receive empathy, but also to give back. I mean, that's that virtuous cycle. If I'm giving back, I'm also receiving, and that happens in a committed community. And as you know, those are fraying. It's under stress right now.
Right. Yes, under major stress. And not only under stress, but it's under stress in part because so many people inside the church seem to be marked by fear as one of the underlying feelings in their life, and a sense of acute anxiety about the other, the stranger, the unknown, the shifting times, the shifting circumstances. And people have particularly pushed toward aggressive reactions often in the church, where the way to respond to fear is by dominance or by seeking power or force of some kind. But there's plenty of evidence in the Gospels that Jesus' strategy was dramatically different than that, and involved moving toward the vulnerable vulnerably and not aggressively, and moving toward the stranger and even the enemy in this way. And just to push this a little bit further, I know that we've both been aware of articles and quotations from different Christian leaders who have said that turning the other cheek just didn't work, that we need warfare, that we need violence and aggression, that somehow living in a world like Jesus seems to be indicating we should do just doesn't work in the modern world. Well, it never worked in the first century world either. And as we're recording this, we're approaching a time of Holy Week and Jesus' own suffering, which Jesus says, actually, we are meant to do ourselves. No, none of these things are common to the language of what, quote, church or faith mean in the modern American church, but they are thickly common in the Gospels themselves. What do you observe about that?
Yeah. So I was reading slowly through the Gospel of Luke, and it felt like I was seeing Jesus in a whole different way along those lines. And then as part of my kind of trying to understand the roots of Christian healthcare, I did some reading in the early church, and really healthcare got started in the early church as there was this deep sense of commitment to serving people who were suffering physically, the plagues as the plagues hit different communities. There was no civic response. The people with means headed for the hills, and the Christian believers headed toward the sick. And there was a nickname for some of these folks that was translated the reckless ones, who even in contexts where they were being persecuted and martyred, they were still showing care and compassion. And that sort of activity changed the world and brought us our hospital system, and was a major impact on the growth of Christianity. I think we might have an opportunity to do that today, to stand out in a different way. And it's really easy to say, yeah, the church should do that. But that puts it into the third person. I should do that.
Right.
I can do that. And again, expressing the healing ministry of Jesus Christ means breaking those social boundaries, and it means making perhaps the ultimate sacrifice. So that's both exciting and a little scary, but it feels like the right way to look at our response in this moment. And I don't quite know where that leads us or what it means, but I do know what it means today. If we have a violent patient on one of our units, it means caring and trying to love that person the best we can. That's an act of love toward a person like that. It's like a bit of yeast falling into a piece of dough. It's going to bring the kingdom slowly but surely.
Right. You know, it's been very moving to me, and I'm sure you've had parallel experiences to this, where I will run into someone who has severe mental health concerns, and not always, but not uncommonly, I will find a parent or a relative or a neighbor, a friend who has really been their ballast in some way, that has stayed in tight with them. And when it works well, that person also knows their limitations. They're not at all thinking that they can let their whole life be dependent on them, but they are vulnerably present, persistently present over time. And when that can then be added to the use of professional care or institutional care in some way or another, it can make it an amazing difference. But when I have had, as I have in some cases, the opportunity to talk to that person who pursued the friend or the relative, I'm just silenced really by the story of what that has cost them, and how moving it is to hear the simplicity often and profundity of their commitment. I mean, it's not something they had to think about. It's not something that was a subject of analysis. It was just a subject of human sacrifice for the sake of someone that they considered full of dignity and beloved, despite or even in the midst of all of the mental health crisis that might be unfolding. It's a very moving story to me, and always challenges me enormously.
That's such a great insight. And an example of that is I can think of a particular situation where, because of the disease of schizophrenia, that those symptoms actually resulted in a lot of paranoia toward the people that loved them the most. And even to the point of planning violence, and was completely out of character for the person with the disease, but also this loving family. And yet, when somebody's making death threats against you and say, no, we're going to get you help, we're going to get you care, it's the bounds of grace and love and care. It's I think that's what your amazement is, and that's my amazement, when people can keep loving in the face of great hostility.
Right. Yeah. I remember a young teenager in Berkeley who had a lot of mental health issues, and her family was really unable to respond. They were just it was beyond their capacity to engage. But as she became known to the community at First Press, to watch her be surrounded by a community of people who really did not have any formal obligation. There was no historic line of connection. She had become a relatively new member and part of the congregation, but she arrived with her full-blown mental health issues. And in that case, I wish I could say it was always the case, but in that case, there was really an amazing response of like the four friends taking the paralytic to Jesus. They were just regularly around her. They provided for her. They worked with professionals to figure out the limits of how far they should go so that they weren't overdoing it. She still needed to find professional help beyond them. But when her family was unable to be that, the church in those cases, in her case, really was exemplary. And it was transformational to me to watch this, because this was not being instigated by me or by anyone else on our staff. This was just thoughtful, loving Christian people trying to live out the life of Jesus in relationship to somebody they could see was in acute need. And they couldn't do it individually, but they could do it collectively. Mm-hmm. And it made a long-term, profound difference. And wonderfully, after years and years of this person came to a really a much, much, much healthier way of living in the world. It was a remarkable story of change.
That's a great story. And I don't know how you do that unless you have this deep value of human life and think this person is made in God's image. So of course we'll do that. That's, that vision to look past, again, looking past the symptoms it's amazing. And there's a quote I love from Cyprian of Carthage. It says, "Let us not be philosophers in word, but in deed." And that indeed is a great example of living a concept, a message incarnate.
Right. I do think, one of the observations I've made is that we often misperceive one another, and then we misname one another, and then we act in relationship to that person with the wrong name and with the wrong perception. So then our actions feel very justified to us, but they're actually off target, literally off target from who this person is. And part of what I think the gospel is meant to do is to help to reform our capacity to perceive at least more humanly, more graciously, more lovingly, and to be able to then name people in light of how God sees people rather than simply in the way that we ourselves might be culturally or in class or education or race or gender prone to misperceive and then prone to misname. And part of the anguish that's going on right now in our culture, part of what's going on in our country right now is a great deal of radical misperception and radical misnaming, which then justifies misbehavior. Mm-hmm. And it's just lethal. And I'm very anxious to see the benefits of a Christian mental health perception of other human beings shape how we actually see and name and then act in response to each other. And while not everything is clinical, I'm not meaning that. I'm just meaning in ordinary life, how do we pause long enough to actually ask, who are you really? How should I name you? Who are you really? And then how can I act in a way that's in response to who you actually really are? That's very hard to do.
It is. And, I agree with you completely. And the more I lean into that and believe that, the more deficits I find in the way I look at people and how I categorize people and judge people. And it seems the closer I come to believing that, the further away I seem to be able to do that, or my deficits get into sharper focus. If I could ask you a question, I mean, you have contacts really all over the world who are living a great political turmoil, who are on the front lines of cultural conversations, who are doing ministry work in various really difficult situations, really globally. What are you seeing around, I guess mental health might be, you can go beyond mental health, but how people are reacting personally and responding? What are you seeing both as ways that aren't perhaps so healthy, or especially ways that they're responding to give you a sense of hope?
Well, I do think one of the differences is that I think for many people in our own country, particularly people who are already at the margins, whether it's economic or racial or something else, and in people around the world, many, many, many people live and have lived, only know life as an experience of protracted trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So the trauma of today is noteworthy, but it's not defining in many places. It feels like it's more or less another version of the tyranny they've already experienced. And for the people who are Christians in such contexts, often one of the things that strikes me the most is that they just don't presume an entitlement or an expectation that life would really be different. Now, that's a sadness, I have to say. To me, that's a deep sadness. But it also both explains, again, back to the practice question, they have lots and lots and lots of practice of feeling as though they are unseen, misnamed, wrongly treated. So there may be times when violence comes near, when the cost of all of that is jacked up, but it's not a fundamentally different positioning. It's just a more heinous outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I find in Christian people that have grown up in those settings a kind of resilience to the reality of evil and sin and human selfishness and power abuse. And sometimes that can look like passivity in a way that doesn't feel as though they're engaging it. But that's not my fundamental sense. My fundamental sense is there's a vigorous sense of engaging it, but it's because they understand that their life is utterly dependent on God. They're not thinking human institutions or organizations or governments or leaders will provide that. So they bury themselves in the best sense inside a Christian community where things can be redefined and intensely life-giving, and find in that strength that is about the providence and mercy of God, not about human agency, willfulness, political planning, all of that. And I find that a great challenge, right? I mean, even right now, as I think about people that are in my mind at different continents, different places of suffering, circumstances of life that I would find if I was suddenly planted in their world, inside their life, I would find their circumstances to be immediately overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
They are not actually overwhelmed. They're candid, honest, clear about the challenge. But they also find that God is meeting them. So the hope that I find is the resiliency of a capacity to lean into suffering in a way that doesn't make them think that suffering equals God's abandonment. So many people I know around the world would never see suffering as a sign of God's departure from them. It's just, this is a normal human experience, and we meet God in suffering, of course, because that's where God meets us, right?
Yeah.
It's just, whereas we tend to have a church built on the presumption of avoiding suffering, and that God would never want me to suffer. And therefore, if there is any pain or suffering going on, then it must be that God has somehow abandoned me. Whereas a lot of global Christians I know will name the suffering, totally raw, plain, truth-telling, and God is meeting us in the middle of this time. That silences me for sure.
There seems like there's so much to learn in that.
So much.
That's going to give me a lot to think about in the next few weeks. And I'm wondering how we can engage with that, so we can learn from people who have had probably a different level of maturity in that area and can have a lot to teach us.
Well, exactly. And this is why I found such relationships so incredibly valuable because where there's enough trust that they're prepared to actually take you into their story, and where they're prepared to let you know how that price has been exacted from them and where they have found God in circumstances that I would have found, I think, it potentially impossible to have seen God. Again, I'm not in any way talking about that terrible narrative of, quote, the happy native in that way that suggests that all this is just not nearly as bad as it is. No, it is every bit as bad as it actually is. And God is with them in the midst of it. And how they've come to see that, and sometimes in fragments and sometimes in abundance. I mean, the abundance of joy that, again, is not the happy native narrative, but that joy is bigger than circumstances. As an example, that reality that does something for mental health.
It does. It also challenges maybe the Western narrative, and I'm going to stereotype a little bit, of if you've got pain, then go see somebody, and they have some medication, and they can either, it might be a painkiller, it might be some other medication that's going to take that pain away. And while I think our work here at Pine Rest Mental Health, we're here to relieve suffering, right? That's an incredibly important part of what we do, and I think part of its reflection of Jesus' ministry.
Yes,
there is suffering that is full of meaning and full of lessons to teach. And what you're describing is a different way of looking at suffering than the Western model is. You come in, you get 5 sessions to get your PHQ-9 depression scores down to this level, and then you're good to go. That is so simplistic and ignores the richness of the life that you're talking about. So it's where it clashes with kind of how we look at Western medicine and how we look at what treatment planning is. While it's great that the world of medicine has embraced mental health as part of itself after being kind of an orphan for a long time, and so insurance does pay for mental health services, but there's a cost you pay for being part of that system that can take away some of the richness if you're not careful of just the meaning of suffering, the growth as human being through suffering, the richness of giving for others and the sacrifice for others that we can tend to overlook in our Western medicine.
Right. Absolutely. That's probably a good place for us to conclude our conversation as we're on the cusp of Holy Week in 2025. We're invited to respond to the acts of Jesus that take him through Holy Week and the cross and the resurrection and Pentecost in a few weeks' time, but not too fast. And I hope that maybe in light of our conversation, we can all have a slower Holy Week and allow the ministry, life, and suffering and sacrifice of Jesus to be even more defining to us than it may be now. Mark, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you even more for your work and labor and leadership, which I just so highly regard. And I thank God for Pine Rest and for all that's happening and for all the good work, even on this very day that is happening, where those healing moments are, I'm sure, happening for many of the people that are being treated. May it long, long, long be so. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And as I've mentioned to you, I really enjoy conversing because it feels like you're having a conversation with a guest over coffee and I'm the third person at the table, and just part of things and listening in and making it comfortable and getting to know people and learning a lot. And that's a healing moment. That's a moment of grace as well. So I appreciate your effort to every week enrich my life with your conversations.
Thank you so much. Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.